The frozen morning of November 19, 1944, brought with it a heavy mist that settled across the battlefield outside Bourg-Altroff, France. A German anti-tank gunner, positioned behind his weapon, trained his sights on the Sherman tanks advancing toward his position. His unit had been locked in combat with these particular American tankers for 3 consecutive days, and what he was witnessing contradicted everything his Nazi instructors had drilled into him about racial hierarchies and the supposed inferiority of certain peoples. Through his optical sights, Schmidt watched as the lead Sherman, clearly damaged and leaving a trail of smoke in its wake, pushed forward despite absorbing multiple direct hits. What caught his attention most was the tank commander himself, a black soldier clearly visible in the exposed turret position, manning the 50 caliber machine gun despite the extreme danger surrounding him. The soldier was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, though Schmidt would not learn this name until many decades had passed, and historians eventually reconstructed the details of this encounter. Rivers had been severely wounded, his leg cut so deeply that the bone was visible, yet he had turned down morphine injections and refused evacuation. Instead, he took control of another tank and led his company forward into Gabeling the following day. For 3 full days, Rivers had continued fighting with a gangrenous wound that should have rendered any ordinary soldier completely incapacitated. What Schmidt observed in those final moments before Rivers' tank met its destruction would remain with him for the remainder of his life. The impact wasn't simply from witnessing violence, nor even from the tactical prowess on display. What truly shook him was how completely it demolished everything he had been taught about racial superiority. The soldiers his ideology had labelled as inferior were displaying levels of courage that exceeded anything he had witnessed throughout 5 years of warfare. When the 761st Tank Battalion entered World War II, they represented far more than just another American military unit joining the European theatre. Their presence marked a confrontation between 2 fundamentally incompatible worldviews. Nazi racial ideology was about to meet its complete refutation on the field of battle. The battalion had adopted a motto that captured their spirit perfectly: "Come out fighting." From their very first engagement at the small Belgian town of Morville-les-Vicq in November 1944, through continuous heavy combat right until the war's conclusion, they embodied this motto completely. But the phrase carried a double meaning that German forces would soon comprehend in the most direct manner possible. Among the German military units preparing to face them were soldiers who had undergone indoctrination in racial superiority from their earliest years. Wehrmacht training materials explicitly stated that black soldiers lacked the capacity to operate complex machinery, possessed no courage, and would retreat at the first indication of combat. These weren't merely casual prejudices floating around in the culture. They were fundamental beliefs that shaped German military doctrine and shaped expectations about how battles would unfold. Over the course of 183 consecutive days in combat, the 761 Saint would systematically prove every single one of these assumptions catastrophically wrong. The 761st was officially constituted on March 15, 1942, and activated on April 1, 1942, at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana. This activation didn't stem from any progressive thinking within the military establishment, but rather from what internal War Department documents termed political necessity to maintain Negro morale. The pathway the battalion followed to reach actual combat differed dramatically from that of white units. The men serving in the 761st trained for nearly 2 full years, acutely aware that white units were shipping overseas after significantly less preparation time. While white armoured battalions typically deployed after 12 to 16 weeks of training, the 761 would spend over 2 years mastering every conceivable aspect of armoured warfare. They understood that any mistake made by any member of their unit would be attributed not to that individual, but to their entire race. Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates, the white officer who commanded the battalion, was considered to have committed career suicide by accepting this position. Bates had served during World War I and had personally witnessed French colonial troops fighting with distinction. More significantly, he evaluated men based on their abilities rather than the color of their skin. After 2 years of intensive training, his assessment was unambiguous. The 761st represented the best-trained tank battalion in the entire United States Army. Among the soldiers who would prove Bates absolutely correct was Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, originally from Hotulka, Oklahoma. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, Rivers had grown up working on a farm and possessed what Bates described as an intuitive understanding of terrain and tactical situations. There was Warren G.H. Creasy, who would eventually earn the nickname Iron Man for his extraordinary endurance in combat conditions. And the battalion also counted among its members someone who would become their most famous member, yet would never see combat himself. First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt Robinson of the 761 was an exceptional athlete who would later become one of baseball's greatest players. Robinson lost his opportunity to see combat when he refused to move to the rear of a segregated military bus during an incident at Fort Hood, Texas, in July 1944. Following their 2-year training period in Texas, the 761st Tank Battalion received orders on June 9, 1944, for overseas movement. This came just 3 days after the D-Day landings had commenced in Normandy. They crossed the Atlantic Ocean aboard the British trooper Esperance Bay, reaching England on September 8, 1944. After a brief period of deployment in England, the battalion landed in France via Omaha Beach on October 10, 1944. They were immediately attached to General George S. Patton's Third Army. Patton's initial skepticism regarding black tankers had been well documented through his personal correspondence. He had written to his wife expressing doubts about their ability to think with sufficient speed for armoured warfare. Yet on October 28, 1944, Patton delivered what would become his famous speech to the assembled battalion. He told them directly that they were the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. He stated that he would never have requested them if they weren't capable, as he maintained nothing but the best in his army. He declared he didn't care about their colour as long as they went forward and killed those German soldiers. He reminded them that everyone had their eyes on them and expected great things from their performance. On November 7, 1944, the Black Panthers finally received their chance when they launched an attack against the German-held town of Morville-les-Vicq in support of the 26th Infantry Division. The German defenders, composed of Wehrmacht infantry mixed with anti-tank units, anticipated an easy victory against what they had been assured were America's inferior troops. The battle lasted 4 hours. Inside the town itself, the lead tank commanded by King was knocked out by a German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon. 2 members of King's crew sustained wounds. Their fellow tankers dragged them to safety behind the disabled tank, then went on to eliminate the soldier who had fired the Panzerfaust. German after-action reports, which have since been discovered in military archives, noted with considerable surprise the exceptional tactical proficiency displayed by the attacking tank unit. They had anticipated panic when their defences knocked out the first tank. Instead, the 761st executed a coordinated assault that methodically eliminated German defensive positions one by one. Another tank commander, Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, encountered a German roadblock that forced his Sherman to halt. Under intense enemy small arms fire from multiple directions, he leaped from his tank, attached a cable from his Sherman to the roadblock obstacle, remounted his vehicle, and had his tank pull the barrier off the road. This freed the entire tank column to resume their advance and ultimately capture the town. Rivers received the Silver Star for this action, marking the first of many decorations the battalion would earn throughout their service. November 1944 saw the 761st engaged in constant combat operations. The unit endured 183 days of continuous operational employment without relief. During November 1944 alone, the battalion suffered 156 casualties, 24 men killed, 81 wounded, and 44 non-battle losses. The unit also lost 14 tanks that had to be evacuated and another 20 that were damaged during combat operations. These dry statistical figures fail to capture what German forces were actually learning through direct experience. The black tankers they had been assured would flee at first contact were instead maintaining an operational tempo that exceeded most white American units. While typical tank battalions were rotated to rear areas after 10 to 14 days of combat for rest and refit, the 761 remained in frontline positions continuously. German intelligence reports from this period, now housed in the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv, begin displaying confusion about the identity of these particular tankers. One report originating from the 11th Panzer Division observes that an enemy tank unit operating in Sector 7 displays exceptional maintenance of vehicles and aggressive tactics that are inconsistent with previous intelligence assessments. The most dramatic demonstration of the 761st's absolute determination came during the assault on Gebling. On November 16, 1944, while the battalion advanced toward the town of Gebling, France, Staff Sergeant Rivers' tank struck a mine at a railroad crossing. Although he was severely wounded, with his leg slashed so deeply that bone was exposed, Rivers declined an injection of morphine and refused evacuation. He took command of another tank and advanced with his company into Gebling the very next day. Captain David Williams, Rivers' company commander, repeatedly issued direct orders for him to evacuate for medical treatment. Rivers' response, as documented in Williams' official report, was straightforward. "Captain, you know better than that. This is going to be tough. Another 2 days won't make any difference." A medic who inspected Rivers' swollen and infected leg looked up in alarm and shouted that he had gangrene. But Williams only had time to say "Reuben" before German guns zeroed in on their position, forcing the Americans to take cover immediately. On November 19, 1944, the end came for Staff Sergeant Rivers. At dawn that day, Company A's tanks advanced toward Bergeltroff, their next objective, but enemy fire brought them to a halt. Captain David J. Williams, commanding the company, ordered his tanks to withdraw and seek cover. Staff Sergeant Rivers, however, radioed that he had spotted the German anti-tank positions. His transmission was clear. "I see them. I see them. We'll fight them." Rivers, joined by another Company A tank, opened fire on the enemy tanks, providing covering fire for Company A as they withdrew to safer positions. While doing so, Rivers' tank took a direct hit that killed him instantly and wounded the remaining crew members. Captain Williams immediately recommended Rivers for the Medal of Honor, though it would require 52 years before this recommendation was properly acted upon. December 16, 1944, brought the Wehrmacht's final major offensive operation, codenamed Operation Watch on the Rhine, which Americans know as the Battle of the Bulge. The 761st was attached to the 87th Infantry Division and thrown directly into the desperate struggle to halt the German breakthrough. The battalion faced some of Germany's finest remaining military units, including elements of the Führer-Begleit Brigade, an elite formation that had been expanded from Hitler's personal escort battalion. The fighting around Tillit, Belgium, proved particularly brutal. Replacements were difficult to obtain, and many of the new soldiers assigned to join the Black Panthers were either completely raw and untrained, or were rejects from other units who were totally unfit for duty. Despite receiving inadequate replacements, the 761st continued fighting without pause. The combat was savage, and the 761st Tank Battalion's Shermans, along with the 87th Division Infantry, had to struggle against bitter resistance at every step. The German forces included Tiger tanks, whose 88mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where the American 75mm guns could destroy Shermans at ranges where millimeter guns couldn't even penetrate the Tiger's armor. Yet the 761st developed tactics to compensate for this disadvantage. They used their superior mobility to flank the heavier German tanks, and they used their mechanical reliability to maintain more vehicles in operational condition. One of the tankers, Sergeant Frank C. Cochran, shouted over the radio during one engagement, "They've hit me 3 times, but I'm still giving them hell." By January 9th, 1945, Tillit was in American hands. The 761st had helped stop the German offensive, but the cost had been heavy. February and March 1945 saw the 761st participating in the assault on the Siegfried Line, Germany's final major fortification system. The battalion was attached to the 103rd Infantry Division for this assault. Within a few days, the Siegfried Line had been broken, and enemy troops began surrendering in increasingly large numbers. By March 23rd, the Black Panthers had destroyed hundreds of enemy vehicles and heavy weapons, inflicted 4,000 casualties, and captured nearly as many prisoners. The combat here differed from what they had experienced in France and Belgium. Now they were fighting on German soil itself, facing increasingly desperate resistance from Wehrmacht and Volkssturm units defending their homeland. Yet German soldiers were also beginning to surrender in larger numbers, particularly when they realized they were facing the black tankers they had heard about through the grapevine. Prisoners were terrified to be captured by black soldiers, believing, thanks to their own propaganda, that they could expect no mercy from such savages. African Americans in the 761st learned not to emerge from their tank hatches until German soldiers came close, lest the surrendering troops see their black skin, howl in terror, and attempt to flee. This fear, based entirely on Nazi propaganda depicting black soldiers as savage and merciless, proved completely unfounded in practice. The 761st treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention protocols and often shared their own rations with captured Germans. As the battalion crossed into Germany proper in March 1945, they encountered scenes that revealed the true nature of the regime they were fighting against. German civilians, conditioned by years of racial propaganda, were terrified of the black soldiers. Many fled rather than remain in areas occupied by the 761st, yet the battalion maintained strict discipline throughout. There were no reprisals against civilians, no looting, no revenge attacks, despite the racial hatred they knew these people had been taught to feel toward them. This professional conduct confused German civilians who had expected the racial inferiors to behave like the savages depicted in Nazi propaganda. Tank battles continued as the 761st pushed deeper into Germany. They faced Panthers, Tigers, and the desperate resistance of SS units. Warren G. H. Creasy, who had earned his Iron Man nickname, was particularly notable during this period. He would often dismount from his tank at night, carrying an M1 Garand rifle to conduct personal reconnaissance missions on foot. One of the most profound moments in the 761st's combat history came on May 2, 1945, when the tankers liberated Gunskirchen concentration camp in Austria, discovering approximately 15,000 Hungarian Jews near death from starvation. The scene that greeted these black tankers defied any adequate description. Thousands of skeletal figures, many unable to stand on their own, filled the camp. The SS guards had fled days earlier, abandoning the prisoners to die. Technician 5th grade Johnny Stevens later recalled the moment. Here were people who looked like skeletons, trying to smile, trying to wave. Some of them were crying. We gave them everything we had, our rations, our chocolate, everything. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone present. Nazi Germany's supposed racial inferiors were liberating the victims of Nazi racial hatred. One woman liberated by the unit, 17-year-old Sonia Schreiber-Weitz, described the soldier who saved her in a poem titled The Black Messiah. The poem captured her first impression. "A black G, I stood by the door. I never saw a black before. He'll set me free before I die, I thought. He must be the Messiah." By the end of April 1945, the 761 would become one of the first US battalions to link up with Soviet forces. This meeting occurred at Steyr, Austria, in early May 1945, with sources varying between April 26th and May 5th to 6th for the exact date. Tanker Leonard Smith received quite a shock when a stout Russian woman tanker approached him, shouting, "America, America, America," repeatedly. She enveloped him in such a tight hug that he could hardly breathe. The Soviet forces, including female tank crews, showed no surprise whatsoever at seeing black American tankers. For them, what mattered was simply that these were fellow soldiers who had survived the brutal fight against Nazi Germany. The 761st Tank Battalion's combat record speaks for itself through the numbers. They spent 183 consecutive days in combat from November 7, 1944 to May 6, 1945. They traversed 6 different countries: France, Belgium, Luxembourg, Netherlands, Germany, and Austria. They participated in 4 major campaigns: Northern France, Rhineland, Ardennes, Alsace, and Central Europe. The casualties they inflicted amounted to approximately 4,000 German casualties, according to National World War II museum records. The German equipment they destroyed included hundreds of vehicles, 31 pillboxes, 49 machine gun emplacements, and 29 anti-tank guns were captured. The unit's own casualties approached a 50% casualty rate. Their initial strength consisted of 36 officers, 30 of them black and 6 white, along with 676 enlisted men. They lost 71 tanks in total during their combat service. The awards they received included 1 Medal of Honor, which was posthumously awarded to Reuben Rivers in 1997. They received 7 Silver Stars, 70 Bronze Stars, and approximately 246 to 300 Purple Hearts. While specific Wehrmacht documents mentioning the 761st by their military designation are limited, German reactions to black American troops are well documented in military archives and prisoner interrogations. One surrendering German officer asked how many Negro Panzer divisions existed. When told there was only 1 battalion, he refused to believe it. The continuous presence of the 761st over those 183 days had created the impression of a much larger force. German prisoners repeatedly expressed surprise at the combat effectiveness of black troops. Interrogation reports from 1945, now housed in the US National Archives, show German soldiers struggling to reconcile what they had personally witnessed with what they had been taught about racial superiority. One captured Wehrmacht sergeant told his interrogators, "We were told the Negroes would run at the first shot. Instead, they kept coming even when we knocked out their tanks. This was not what we expected." The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945, but the 761st's fight was far from finished. Like their white comrades, African-American tankers struggled with memories and, in many cases, what we now recognize as post-traumatic stress. Unlike white soldiers, however, black soldiers had to deal with segregation and the often savage racial prejudice that remained characteristic of this period in American history. Texas Native Staff Sergeant Floyd Dade Jr. described the contradictions facing black soldiers returning to the United States in an oral history. "We didn't have equal rights. Democracy was against us." The men who had destroyed German tanks and liberated concentration camps returned to an America where they couldn't eat in many restaurants, were required to sit in the back of buses, and faced violent racism. German prisoners of war being held in the United States were often treated better than the black soldiers who had actually captured them. For 33 years, the 761st Tank Battalion's achievements went officially unrecognized at the unit level. Individual medals were awarded, but the Presidential Unit citation that white battalions received immediately was denied to them. It wasn't until January 24, 1978, that President Jimmy Carter awarded the Presidential Unit citation to the 761st. The citation read in part, "The 761st Tank Battalion distinguished itself by extraordinary gallantry, courage, professionalism, and high esprit de corps displayed in the accomplishment of unusually difficult and hazardous operations." The ultimate recognition came in 1997, when 7 members of the battalion, including Staff Sergeant Reuben Rivers, posthumously received the Medal of Honor. Not until over 50 years later, on January 12, 1997, was the Medal of Honor finally bestowed on Platoon Sergeant Reuben Rivers. President Clinton noted at the ceremony that no African American who deserved the Medal of Honor for service in World War II had received it at the time, and they were finally correcting this injustice. One of the most interesting transformations involved General Patton himself. Despite his initial skepticism about black soldiers, Patton's assessment of the 761 Saint changed dramatically through their service. During the Battle of the Bulge, when German soldiers who had raided American warehouses were reported to have disguised themselves as Americans and were guarding checkpoints in order to ambush American soldiers, Patton solved this problem by ordering black soldiers, including members of the 761st, to guard the checkpoints. He gave the order to shoot any white soldiers at the checkpoints who acted suspiciously. This order demonstrated remarkable trust on Patton's part. He was literally placing the security of his entire army in the hands of black soldiers he had once doubted could think fast enough for armored warfare. By the end of the war, Patton had recommended the 761 Saint for numerous commendations. While his personal racial views remained complex and problematic throughout his life, his military assessment of the battalion was unequivocal. They were among his best units. Ironically, the racism that kept the 761st training for 2 years instead of the standard few months became their greatest advantage. The men of the 761st trained for almost 2 full years, conscious of the fact that white units were being sent overseas after much less training. This extensive training meant that when the 761st finally entered combat, they were possibly the best prepared tank battalion in the entire US Army. They could perform maintenance tasks in complete darkness, had memorized every aspect of their tank's operation, and had developed a unit cohesion that only comes from extensive time spent together. Lieutenant Colonel Paul Bates later testified that the delay in sending them to combat, which was wrong and racist in its motivation, accidentally created the best-trained tank battalion in the Army. They could accomplish things with Shermans that shouldn't have been possible. While Reuben Rivers received the most recognition posthumously, Warren G. H. Creasy's story deserves special attention as well. Known as the Iron Man, Creasy survived the entire war despite being wounded multiple times and destroying extraordinary amounts of German equipment. During one engagement, Creasy's tank was knocked out by German fire. Instead of withdrawing to safety, he took control of a .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a half-track and used it to provide covering fire for his crew's escape, while simultaneously destroying the German position that had knocked out his tank. He would often volunteer for the most dangerous assignments, leading reconnaissance missions on foot behind enemy lines. Creasy survived the war, but like many veterans, he struggled with what would now be recognized as PTSD. He rarely spoke about his experiences, and it wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit citation that his extraordinary service received proper recognition. One aspect of the 761st service that genuinely surprised German forces was their mechanical proficiency. Nazi propaganda had insisted that black soldiers couldn't operate complex machinery. Instead, the 761st maintained one of the highest operational readiness rates in the entire Third Army. This was partly due to their extended training period, but also to the dedication of men like Technician 5th Grade William Harvey, who could diagnose engine problems simply by listening to them. The battalion's maintenance crews worked through the night, often under fire, to keep tanks running. German reports expressed bewilderment at seeing damaged Sherman tanks they thought they had knocked out of action reappearing in combat just hours later. The relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge represented another significant achievement for the 761. They faced not just regular Wehrmacht forces, but also SS units making desperate attempts to maintain the encirclement. The 101st Airborne Division, surrounded and running low on everything from ammunition to medical supplies, watched as the 761st Shermans broke through German lines to reach them. One paratrooper later recalled, "We didn't care what colour they were. They were the most beautiful sight we'd ever seen." The 761st produced exceptional combat leaders throughout their service. Captain Erwin McHenry, Captain John Long, and Lieutenant Charles Barber all demonstrated tactical brilliance under fire repeatedly. These black officers commanded not through the formal military hierarchy alone, but through earned respect and demonstrated competence on the battlefield. Captain David Williams, who commanded Company A, submitted more Medal of Honor recommendations for his men than any other company commander in the battalion. Most of these recommendations were downgraded or completely ignored due to racial prejudice at higher command levels, only being properly recognized decades later. The 761st's success came partly from their exceptional cooperation with infantry units. Despite initial prejudice from white infantry units who had been conditioned by the same racial attitudes prevalent in society, the tankers' combat performance quickly earned genuine respect. During the assault on Klimbach, France, white infantrymen specifically requested the 761st support, having observed their effectiveness in previous engagements. The battalion's consistent willingness to provide close infantry support, often at great risk to themselves, saved countless infantry lives throughout their deployment. One infantry sergeant wrote home describing his experience. "The coloured tank boys saved our bacon more times than I can count. They'd drive right into German fire to give us cover. I don't care what anyone says back home. These men are heroes." The 761st's aggressive combat style was reflected clearly in their ammunition consumption statistics. They fired over 300 tons of ammunition during their deployment, an extraordinary amount for a single battalion. This wasn't wasteful or inaccurate shooting, but sustained, precise fire that reflected their extensive training. German after-action reports frequently noted the unusual accuracy of American tank fire in sectors where the 761 was operating. As casualties mounted throughout their extended combat service, the 761st faced a unique problem within the segregated army structure. The military had limited numbers of trained black tank crew replacements available. Many of the new men assigned to join the Black Panthers were either raw and untrained, or, being rejects from other units, were totally unfit for duty. This meant that experienced crew members couldn't be rotated out of combat for rest and recovery. Exhausted men continued fighting because there simply was no one adequately trained to replace them. This situation contributed to both the extraordinary heroism displayed and the high casualty rate suffered by the unit. The presence of the 761st created significant problems for German propaganda efforts. Soldiers who had directly faced black American tankers in combat found themselves in direct conflict with official Nazi racial theory. Wehrmacht morale reports from early 1945 note increasing skepticism about racial propaganda among troops who had faced black American units in battle. Soldiers were asking uncomfortable questions. If the racial theory is true, why are we losing battles to inferior races? This cognitive dissonance contributed to the collapse of fighting spirit in many German units during the war's final months. Before their deployment overseas, the 761 Saint had trained in the American South under Jim Crow conditions. Most of the black tankers had to train in installations located in southern states such as Kentucky, Louisiana, and Texas. In the days before the civil rights advances made in the 1960s, black people were still treated harshly throughout the South and were often considered inferior by white residents. At Camp Hood, Texas, they faced constant racial harassment from both military personnel and local civilians. Local businesses refused to serve them. Military buses operated under strict segregation. The battalion was housed in the worst part of the base, near the sewage treatment plant. Yet this constant adversity forged extraordinary unity among the men. The soldiers of the 761st knew they were fighting two separate wars simultaneously, one against the Germans in Europe and another against racism in their own country. This dual purpose gave them a determination that German forces couldn't understand or overcome on the battlefield. The most famous member of the 761st remains First Lieutenant Jack Roosevelt, Jackie Robinson. During the 761st's training period, a white bus driver ordered Robinson to move to the back of the bus. Robinson refused and was subsequently arrested. Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Paul L. Bates refused to consider the court-martial charges put forward by the arresting military policeman. The post commander then transferred Robinson to the 758th Tank Battalion, whose commander was willing to sign the insubordination court-martial order. Robinson was court-martialed but was acquitted on all charges. However, the legal proceedings meant he missed the 761st's deployment to Europe. He received an honourable discharge in November 1944 and would go on to break baseball's colour barrier in 1947, becoming a transformative figure in American sports and civil rights history. On November 10, 2005, a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion was unveiled at Fort Hood, now renamed Fort Cavazos, Texas. The monument features 4 black granite tablets surrounding a life-size marble sculpture of a 761st Tank Battalion fighter kneeling atop a black granite pedestal engraved with a tank image on the front and a panther on the back. The dedication ceremony was attended by surviving veterans, their families, and military officials from various branches. The keynote speaker at the dedication noted that the 761st had fought not just for victory over Nazi Germany, but for the fundamental principle that all Americans, regardless of race, could serve their country with distinction and honour. Perhaps the most meaningful validation of the 761st's combat effectiveness came from an unexpected source. During the 1990s, American military historians conducting interviews with former Wehrmacht veterans about tank warfare encountered consistent mentions of exceptional American tank units. When asked to identify these specific units, German veterans frequently described the black tankers who had fought with particular ferocity and skill. These were men who had absolutely no reason to praise their former enemies, yet they consistently identified the 761st as among the best tank units they had faced throughout the entire war. One former German tank commander stated simply, "They fought like devils." We couldn't understand why men their own country treated as inferior fought so hard for it. Now I think perhaps that was why. They had something to prove, and they proved it beyond any doubt. The human cost of the 761st service was severe. With nearly 50% casualties, the battalion paid an extraordinarily heavy price for their achievements. Families back home received telegrams informing them that their sons, husbands and fathers had died fighting for a country that didn't grant them full citizenship rights. Yet the survivors rarely expressed bitterness about this fundamental contradiction. Leonard Smith, who became a New York City transit officer after the war, explained in a 1995 interview, "We knew what we were fighting for was bigger than the prejudice we faced. We were fighting for what America could be, not what it was at that moment." For decades following the war, the 761's story remained largely unknown outside the black community. History textbooks, when they mentioned black soldiers at all, typically focused exclusively on support units. The combat achievements of units like the 761 Saint were minimized or completely ignored in mainstream historical narratives. This began to change during the 1970s with the civil rights movement's emphasis on recovering and publicizing black history that had been suppressed or overlooked. The 1978 Presidential Unit Citation brought national attention to the battalion's achievements. The 1997 Medal of Honor ceremony brought even more widespread recognition. Today, the 761st Tank Battalion is recognized as one of the most effective armored units that operated in the European theater. Their story is now taught at the U.S. Army Armor School, studied at West Point Military Academy, and honored in museums throughout the United States and Europe. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion remains profoundly relevant to contemporary society. It demonstrates conclusively that prejudice and discrimination represent a waste of human potential on a massive scale. The Army's initial reluctance to use black soldiers in combat roles nearly deprived it of one of its finest tank battalions. The story also shows that true excellence cannot be suppressed by prejudice, no matter how institutionalized that prejudice might be. Despite facing discrimination from their own country and deadly hatred from their enemies, the men of the 761 St. Tank Battalion achieved extraordinary things through skill, courage, and unwavering determination. Their story challenges all of us to examine our own prejudices and preconceptions honestly. If Nazi Germany, one of history's most militarily proficient nations, could be so catastrophically wrong about racial capabilities, what assumptions do we make today that might prove equally false? The 761st's combat record became a powerful argument for military integration in the post-war period. When President Truman signed Executive Order 9981 in 1948, officially desegregating the armed forces, the combat achievements of units like the 761 Saint were specifically cited as evidence that segregation actually weakened military effectiveness rather than strengthening it. During the Korean War that began in 1950, integrated military units performed exceptionally well, validating what the 761st had already proven on the battlefields of Europe: that competence and courage know absolutely no racial boundaries. Many veterans of the 761st served as advisors during this integration process, sharing lessons learned from their unique experience of proving themselves under the most extreme combat conditions imaginable. Individual veterans of the 761st faced varied post-war experiences upon returning home. Some, like E.G. McConnell, successfully used the GI Bill to obtain college educations that would have been completely impossible before the war. Others faced continued discrimination in employment and housing despite their distinguished military service. Many veterans struggled with PTSD, then called combat fatigue or shell shock, for years after the war ended. Like many combat veterans across all races, they rarely spoke about their experiences with family members. It wasn't until the 1978 Presidential Unit Citation Ceremony that many families finally learned the full extent of their relatives' heroism during the war. The complete story of the 761st has been painstakingly pieced together from various sources over the decades. These sources include official army records, German military archives captured after the war, personal letters and diaries kept by soldiers, and oral histories collected decades later from aging veterans. Each source adds crucial details to the picture of extraordinary service performed under impossible circumstances. The U.S. Army's official history of World War II, published during the 1950s, barely mentioned the 761st at all. It took independent historians and the veterans themselves working together to ensure their story was properly preserved for future generations. Today, the National Archives holds extensive records documenting the battalion's service, available to researchers and the general public. The 761st's liberation of Gunskirchen concentration camp is now commemorated at Yad Vashem, Israel's official memorial to Holocaust victims. Survivors of the camp and their descendants have maintained connections with battalion veterans and their families over the decades. In 2015, the Austrian government invited surviving members of the 761st to special ceremonies marking the 70th anniversary of the war's end. They were honoured not merely as liberators, but as men who had shown profound humanity in the midst of inhuman circumstances. The German Tigers and Panthers never expected the 761st Black Panthers to fight at all, much less to continue fighting for 183 consecutive days without relief or rotation. Nazi racial ideology had assured them absolutely that black soldiers were incapable of operating tanks effectively, that they lacked courage in combat situations, and would flee at first contact with enemy forces. Instead, German forces encountered men who had trained longer, fought harder, and endured more than almost any other American unit in the European theatre. The 761st didn't just contribute to defeating Nazi Germany militarily. They demolished its racial ideology through undeniable combat excellence that could not be explained away or dismissed. From the moment they first entered combat until the end of the war in Europe, the men of the 761 received 7 Silver Stars, 246 Purple Hearts, and 1 Congressional Medal of Honor. These decorations, with many awarded decades late due to racial prejudice in the military bureaucracy, only hint at the full extent of their heroism and sacrifice. The 761st Tank Battalion fought for 183 days without relief, not because they weren't exhausted beyond description. They were. Not because they didn't suffer devastating casualties. They lost nearly half their men. They fought because they carried the hopes and dignity of millions of black Americans who were being told they weren't good enough to serve their country in combat roles. Every Sherman tank they drove into battle carried more than just ammunition and fuel. It carried the weight of representation, the burden of proof, and the iron determination to demonstrate conclusively that courage and competence know no colour whatsoever. Every German position they destroyed and captured struck a blow not just against the Wehrmacht, but against the racial prejudices of 2 nations simultaneously, their enemies and their own country. The German forces that faced them in combat learned a lesson that fundamentally challenged everything they had been taught from childhood. The black soldiers they had been assured were subhuman proved to be extraordinary human beings. The inferior troops their propaganda had described demonstrated superior courage under fire. The men who supposedly shouldn't have been able to operate complex machinery mastered tank warfare at the highest conceivable level. In the final analysis, the 761st Tank Battalion's greatest victory wasn't measured in towns captured or enemy tanks destroyed, as impressive as those statistics were. Their greatest victory was proving, beyond any possible doubt, under the most extreme circumstances imaginable, that excellence is not determined by race but by training, determination, and character. They were the Black Panthers. They came out fighting, just as their motto proclaimed. And for 183 days without relief, against enemies who never expected them to fight at all, they never stopped proving their worth. Their legacy lives on today, not just in military history books and museums, but in the ongoing struggle for equality and recognition that their tremendous sacrifice helped advance. The German Tigers expected easy prey when they first encountered these tankers. They found instead the Black Panthers, and they learned the hard way that everything they believed about race and warfare was fundamentally, catastrophically wrong.